Hi, everyone, and welcome to video 6 of Unit 4, Expansion, Regionalism, and Reform from 1800 to 1848. Okay, so we are going to dive back into politics after a little economic break there in which we were talking about the market revolution. So in this video, we're going to be focusing on two of our topics from the AP curriculum framework. We're going to look at 4.7, Expanding Democracy, and 4.8, Jackson and Federal Power. So let's get started. So starting with, how did political participation and party affiliation changed during the early 19th century? So in the early 19th century, we see a pretty significant expansion of democracy, participatory democracy. So small farmers, workers, frontiersmen increasingly are demanding franchise or the right to vote. And a lot of this happens because of the Panic of 1819. So the Second Bank of the US, you may recall, tightened their lending policies. They were loaning less money to try to control inflation. But the restriction of funds caused a lot of state banks to actually close, leaving people with worthless paper money. So there was a decrease in demand for American exports. There was an increase in unemployment, bankruptcy, and debtors' prison for people who couldn't pay their debts. So laboring men, especially laboring men in the West, really wanted to hold politicians accountable for what they saw as the kind of economic ills of the day. So until this point, the right to vote had mostly still been attached to property ownership. The Panic of 1819 is going to combine with the fact that in a lot of these Western territories and states, they had already given the right to vote to all white men, should be noted. And that meant that national rules for voting were also under pressure to change. So by 1825, most states had lowered or eliminated the property qualifications for voting. So again, big expansion in political participation. And in fact, between 1824 and 1828, the amount of people who are eligible to participate in voting federally doubled. Okay, we're also going to start to see some fragmenting of political parties. Now, you may recall after the War of 1812, Federalists had essentially become defunct. They had completely crumbled. Essentially, by the 1820s, the Democratic Republicans were the only political party really left standing, the only major or significant one left standing. But even the Democratic Republicans are really beginning to fragment. So what we're going to see is these kind of two different groups emerging. The National Republicans have a much more expansive view of federal power. They're going to share a lot of old Federalist ideas about the loose construction of the Constitution. And people like this are going to be Henry Clay and John Quincy Adams. On the other hand, you have the Democratic Republicans. By 1828, they're just going to be shortened to be called the Democrats, who are still more like the Jeffersonian politics of old, okay? They're going to really want limited federal power and very strict constructionism of the Constitution, and that's going to be Andrew Jackson and his supporters. So after 1832, the National Republicans join with Northern and Southern conservatives, people who are supporters of the National Bank and anti-Jackson, to become the Whig Party. That party is named after the British party that opposed too much power in the monarchy. And this is partially because Andrew Jackson believed very strongly in a strong executive branch. Even if he called for states' rights, he personally believed in a strong executive branch, a strong president. So they started calling Andrew Jackson King Jackson. Okay, so this kind of leads us to, I think, a good point to talk a little bit about the difference between Jeffersonian democracy and Jacksonian democracy. This is supposed to say Jeffersonian versus Jacksonian, not Jeffersonian versus democracy up there. So in some ways, they were very similar. Okay, they both believed, both of these kind of different groups believed in strict construction of the Constitution and a strict interpretation and relatively limited federal power. But there definitely are some legitimate and serious shifts as we move from Jeffersonian democracy into Jacksonian democracy, from Jeffersonian in the 1800s, 1810s, the War of 1812, by Jackson's era in the 1820s and 30s. So let's talk a little bit about this. Now, you may recall a lot about Jeffersonian democracy. Jefferson believed very strongly in limiting the federal power. Federal power needed to be limited control in order to ensure that states' rights and personal freedoms reigned supreme. That was absolutely the most important thing to Jefferson. They had a pretty strong distrust of manufacturing. That is going to start to change a little bit about after the War of 1812, when it becomes really apparent that the U.S. cannot be dependent on foreign nations for manufactured goods. But by and large, as we've discussed, Jefferson saw the future of the economy as agrarian, the future of America as agrarian. He believed that power followed property. And remember, in the era of Jeffersonian democracy in the very early 19th century, there are still property requirements for voting for most people. So, in most places. So, he believed that because power followed property, it should be very widely distributed. We should have small yeoman farms. He didn't really trust wage laborers, manufacturers, people who worked for a low wage in a factory or a mill. He felt that they couldn't be trusted because they could be sort of bought or very easily influenced in their political views. So at that point, he felt that wage laborers were simply not independent political thinkers. He had a very strong fear of the corrupting influence of consolidated power, which is one of the reasons why we maintain such a small army and navy under the Jeffersonian era. And then he also thought that national projects like the American system and the National Bank would only enrich the wealthy, and then they would burden the common laborers and farmers. He also believed strongly in a meritocracy of capable men. He did not think that every man was suited to rule. He believed, consider that Jefferson was a highly educated man himself. He believed that the most capable men would sort of rise to the top to be sort of the ruling class. So a sort of meritocracy. To be fair, he also supported public education, which is a little bit unusual considering that he believed in really strongly in personal freedoms, but he also believed that the government should pay for public education so that people could become educated and have a chance at becoming one of those meritocratic, capable men who ruled the government. But overall, Jefferson is known for saying the government that is best is the one which governs the least. Jackson, on the other side, and like I said, there's a lot of similarities here between Jacksonian democracy and Jeffersonian democracies, but there's some differences too. Jackson was the hero of the common man, the champion of the common man, and the hero of the Battle of New Orleans. Jackson pushed really hard for the removal of property requirements for voting. Jackson himself was from the frontier. He was the first president to come from sort of outside the halls of power. The traditional places of power were Virginia and New England. He comes from the frontier. He himself had no formal education. So he argued that all men, and I should again clarify, all white men, because this is not a point yet at which we are expanding democracy to people of color or to women, but he believed that all white men were capable of holding office, regardless of whether they had property, regardless of whether or not they had formal education. So this is kind of different from Jefferson. He believed that you didn't have to have an education to hold office and be a leader, and as he himself did not. The other way he kind of expanded the kind of idea of participation in the government was the spoils system that he kind of created, where he convinced people to volunteer to kind of support him in his campaign by promising federal government employment after he became president, which he did. This is called the spoils system because the idea of to the victor go the spoils. Once he won, he handed out these sort of government jobs to his supporters. Now, I kind of already mentioned this, but even though he didn't believe the federal government should have a lot of power, he did believe in a strong executive branch, which of course is the president, which of course he was. Additionally, unlike Jeffersonian Democrats, he believed that manufacturing was necessary. He recognized the necessity of manufacturing. But since he's a representative of the common man, most of the common men were farmers, he also recognized the need for a lot of farming land. So we're going to see the Indian Removal Act occur under his presidency as well. And we'll talk about that more in just a minute. Okay, so one last thing to talk about before we move into kind of some of the 4.8 topics, and that is the election of 1824, which was crazy. The Democratic Republicans had 4 candidates: John Quincy Adams, Henry Clay, William Crawford, and Andrew Jackson. Jackson and Andrews were the biggest contenders by far. Jackson won most of the popular vote, but no one won a majority of electoral votes, which meant, according to the Constitution, that candidate has to be chosen by the House of Representatives. So then Clay pulls out of the running, and he throws all his support behind John Quincy Adams and uses power and influence in the House of Representatives to get Adams elected. And Jackson was so mad about this. Clay became Adams' Secretary of State, right, in this bargain. And Jackson called this the corrupt bargain. although no laws were actually broken. It was really just kind of smart politics, but no laws were actually broken. But even though Jackson won the popular vote, he was so mad because he did not actually win the presidency. Now, he is, of course, going to win the presidency in 1828. So that's coming. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the primary political debates between Whigs and Democrats in the 1830s. Now, we already talked about this a little bit, but by the 1820s and 30s, we've got the Democrats and the Whigs. Democrats led by Jackson, right? We've got that more strict constructionism, limited federal power. They did like free trade, but they believed strongly in local or state rule. They hated corporate monopolies. They hated high tariffs and the national bank. The Whigs, on the other hand, are led by Henry Clay. They believe in that kind of more loose constructionism of Hamilton's days. They believed in a more involved central government. Again, think of Henry Clay's American system. And they liked the National Bank, which was, of course, established. The Second National Bank was established by Henry Clay's American system. Protective tariffs, federally funded improvements, all part of Henry Clay's American system. They believed in infrastructure like roads and canals. And they were very concerned about crime committed by immigrants. So we had a strong nativist tone in the Whig Party as well. Now, the biggest debate between these two parties, unsurprisingly, is the thing we're mostly still arguing about today, the role of federal power, specifically in this case in regards to the National Bank, tariffs, and internal improvements. So let's talk about this. So we know a tariff is a tax on imported goods. You may recall from previous videos, there was a tariff passed in 1816 as part of Henry Clay's American system plan. A tariff is called a protective tariff because it's intended to protect domestic manufacturers from competition from cheaper foreign imports. The tariff effectively raises the price of imported goods and then causes more people to buy domestic products. Domestic products are those that are produced in the country, in this case for us in the United States. And then, so in 1828, we see another tariff passed, a really big one. It passes during the final month of John Quincy Adams' administration. It raises tariffs, it raises duties by 35 to 45%. This is a big, big tax. Super beneficial to northern manufacturers and actually Western farms. But Southerners who relied really strongly on imported goods were suffering. Southerners hated this. Okay, so here's where it gets a little crazy. Jackson becomes president in 1828, and all the Southerners expect him, who is so representative of, the common man and, weak federal government power and more states' rights to rule. They believe that clearly he'll get rid of this tariff, except Jackson also kind of realizes the need for tariff and the need for domestic manufacturing. So he decides not to do anything about the tariff was just passed. But his vice president, John C. Calhoun from South Carolina, called it the tariff of abominations. He hated it. So Calhoun helped to develop in South Carolina the doctrine of nullification. Now, he actually penned this nullification document quietly. He didn't, anonymously, but he was the one who actually wrote it. He argued that if a state judged a federal law to be unconstitutional, that state could pretend it didn't exist and then nullify it. And you would think this is something Jackson would be all for because for states' rights. But don't forget, he's the king. He's not the king. He's the president now. And he believes in a really strong executive branch. He was mad. His own vice president is being so insubordinate. He persuades Congress to pass the Force Bill in 1833, which gave him the power to respond to South Carolina with military action, literally going and threatening them with, National Guard troops to force them to pay the tariff. So South Carolina had been threatening to secede from the Union over the matter, but they didn't get any response from other southern states. Nobody else was willing to jump in with them. And then the Force Bill was passed. So they really lose a lot of their ability to fight here. Eventually, Henry Clay, our great negotiator, is going to step in again and help get that tariff reduced. And they agreed, okay, we're not going to secede. So South Carolina did submit to federal authority, but they went ahead and still said, oh, we're nullifying the Force Bill, even though it wasn't very effective because the Force Bill was not actually needed at this point. So this whole situation was known as the nullification crisis. Okay, other divisions, the National Bank. Now, you may recall Jackson, not a huge fan of the National Bank. He saw them as beneficial to the wealthy, as poorly managed, even though it really wasn't. It was actually pretty decently managed by the 1830s by a man named Nicholas Biddle. But the Second National Bank had been established in 1816 and was pretty helpful actually in the 1820s in stabilizing the economy. But in the 1830s, some state banks had to close because they couldn't make payments to the National Bank. Now, as I said, Jackson thought the National Bank in the first place was unconstitutional, that the federal government never had a right to make a federal bank in the first place. And he felt he could really harm the lower classes and just prop up the wealthy. So when the National Bank's charter is up, in 1832, Henry Clay convinces Congress that, hey, we need to pass a bill to renew the charter. And they do. But then Jackson vetoes it. Okay. He also moves all the federal funds to what became to be called pet banks, which are essentially just various state banks. So he vetoes the bank's charter. Citizens love him. They see him again as the champion of the common man, fighting this evil, bad national bank, and they reelect Jackson a second time by an overwhelming majority, a 3/4 majority. Okay, so again, also division over internal improvements. We've already talked about this, but the American system had authorized roads and canals to be built with federal authority. Whigs saw the expenditures as necessary to keep the country connected, but Democrats saw this as an overreach of federal power and the expenditures as unconstitutional. So they're going to push back against federal power or federal expenditures on state internal improvements. So mostly internal improvements are going to be left to states to kind of figure out as they will. Okay, last thing to talk about in this video is the Indian Removal Act of 1830. So Jackson, as I mentioned, he represented the common man, which is mostly farmers at this point, and there was a lot of land-hungry farmers in the South and the West that are really pushing for territory, much of which is occupied by American Indians. So by 1830, the Cherokee Nation in Georgia had declared itself a sovereign nation that existed entirely within the bounds of the state of Georgia. Now, Georgia disagreed and said, no, you're not a sovereign nation at all. And this becomes really, really intense when gold is discovered on their lands. So in 1830, Jackson is going to sign into law the Indian Removal Act that mandated that all American Indians had to be relocated forcibly, if necessary, west of the Mississippi River and into the Oklahoma Territory. Now, the Cherokee are going to challenge the constitutionality of this removal in a couple different court cases. One that's really significant is in 1832, Worcester versus Georgia. The Supreme Court actually sided with the Cherokee. They said Georgia had no right to impose state laws within Cherokee boundaries because they said the Cherokee boundaries enjoyed federal protection. So it wasn't they recognized the Cherokee as their own nation. Rather, they said, no, this is federal protection. This is a federal issue versus a state's issue. But Jackson refused to support this. In this case, he's like, nah, man, states' rights all the way, because he wanted to keep farmers happy with him. So without that kind of support from the president, Worcester versus Georgia was very difficult to enforce. So in 1835, a small group of the Cherokee, completely without tribal sanction, are going to meet kind of secretly with U.S. officials, and they're going to sign the Treaty of New Echota, which is exchanged Cherokee lands in the east for reservation territory west of the Mississippi. Now, most Cherokee and other American Indians did not agree with this. By 1838, though, the forced removal of Cherokee and other tribes is going to begin. And this becomes known as the Trail of Tears because of the sickness and dying that occurred along the way. At least 4,000 Cherokee died and many others. A lot of people violently resisted the removal or hid. Some settled in North Carolina and eventually sort of became citizens of the United States. But this is sort of one of the most egregious acts of the U.S. government against this sort of sovereign people, although their sovereignty at the time was not recognized. Okay, so that's it for us for Jackson and federal power. In the next couple videos, we're going to be getting into the Second Great Awakening and reform, so stay tuned for that.